My name is Rob Verkerk. I'm a scientist, a sustainability scientist. I'm 57 years old. I've got 6 children. My eldest is a medical doctor, so I've watched his progress through the ranks and to see what elements have been engaged with his own education and even seeing obviously where some of the gaps can be in terms of what we're dealing with. As a scientist, my original training was in ecology, and then I moved from that into sustainable agriculture while I was at Imperial College London. So I have an undergraduate degree in ecology. I've got a master's and PhD in sustainable agriculture, and then I went on to do another 7 years of postdoctoral research at Imperial College London. And at that point, as an expert in sustainable and organic agriculture, but someone who had real concerns in terms of the way in which agriculture was developing, I was increasingly stunned by the lack of communication between those of us who are engaged with the food supply and those who are engaged with health. So, why do agricultural scientists and medical doctors have almost no communication, given that there is an increasing body of evidence to suggest that what we eat and how we eat is absolutely of crucial significance to our health, and particularly our long-term health as we age. And with increasing burden of chronic diseases, I became really concerned about dietary simplification, the fact that more and more of us are eating a narrower and narrower range of plant sources, plant foods. Many of these have been manipulated through plant breeding as well as genetic modification to a degree that they're very, very different from the heritage varieties that we grow. On top of that, there are huge changes to agricultural conditions. A lot of salad vegetables are being grown hydroponically that the consumer doesn't know the difference between those and soil grown vegetables. So I was increasingly being asked by the nutritional sector to provide talks and advice about what is happening in agriculture. And as a result of that, got more and more concerned about the politics behind big food, big pharma. And then I decided to set up the Alliance for Natural Health back in 2002 and leave my position at the university. My sense at that time was that most of the biggest problems we face in human societies, the answers are already known. And if you continue as a research scientist, you are basically needing to keep on finding new research, new justifications for research, so you can put more and more journals on your bookshelf. But of course you then don't use that knowledge and background to create the political change that actually drives some of the fundamental changes we needed. So that's why I decided 15 years or so ago to become a campaigner again, as well as a researcher, as well as an educator. So essentially that's what we do in the Alliance for Natural Health International now. We're involved across all 3 major areas.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at what you do, and there's an incredible variety and depth in what you do, but I suppose in the context of this series, it's all to do with health, which helps us, things that help us live more healthily to a riper, older age.
Correct. Essentially, the common link with everything I do is sustainability. We've applied very well concepts of sustainability to energy, even to agriculture. So most people know about renewable resources, the fact that it's good to be more economical if we are driving vehicles with internal combustion engines. But the concept of sustainability has not been applied to healthcare. And the system that we're running at the moment in terms of mainstream medicine is moving at 100 miles an hour towards a brick wall. We've got a major issue with a top-heavy age structure. People who... Well, sustainability as a concept is about how you can keep something going pretty much indefinitely. And we've seen it applied to the environment. We know that human existence on the planet in its current form is creating major challenges for the world in terms of the use of resources and pollution. If we look at individual elements of human activities such as agriculture or energy, we've also seen sustainability being applied there. So in sustainable energy, we know that the use of renewable resources such as solar, wind power, even nuclear fusion are sustainable systems of energy production. If we look at agriculture, we know that, say, organic agriculture, biodynamic agriculture are examples of sustainable agriculture as well. It's a big difference from highly intensive farming techniques relying on monoculture, for example. What we haven't seen is the application of sustainability to healthcare in any real sense. Generally speaking, when people in the healthcare space talk about sustainability, they're thinking about the use of sustainable resources. The essential problem we have is linked with the fact that most of medicine is geared towards treatment of symptoms, and of course, generally speaking, it comes in too late. We start trying to fix people when they're already in a very deep state of disease. If we could turn the clock back and look at treating much earlier in the disease life cycle, or better than that still, before the disease actually begins to manifest subclinically, we'd be in a much better position again. So this means actually dealing with preventative medicine, preventative healthcare in a true sense, rather than just talking about it. And of course, that means self-care, the ability of the individual to manage themselves and take responsibility for their health, and then be guided by the healthcare professional, but also not necessarily just a healthcare professional, but someone who can help them with mindfulness, can help them with physical activity, and all the other elements that make up the ecosystem of health. So that's, in a nutshell, what sustainable healthcare is about.
Is there anywhere this is working? Are there any examples that we can see to explain this?
Of course, some of the best examples are in the blue zone communities that have been doing this for a very long time. So, you know, if we look to Sardinia or Ikaria or the Okinawans, for example, we can see examples of this working, and we see a number of common trends. You know, yes, activity, physical activity is built into everyone's lives, but it's part of daily life. It's not necessarily going to pump iron in the gym for an hour when your cortisol levels are very low at the end of a very long, highly stressed day. It's also about moderate caloric intake. It's about eating nutrient-dense, mainly plant foods. It's about having purpose in your life. It's about sleeping adequately. So we can see in a classic sort of Western lifestyle, which of course is now becoming the dominant lifestyle regardless of where you are, even in the East, we're moving a million miles away from that. We're disconnecting from our evolutionary heritage. So when one starts to apply principles of sustainability to healthcare, we really have to understand that reconnecting to nature is actually a big part of it. We can't all the time look for silver bullets or technological solutions to healthcare, and at the same time, it's not about going backwards, it's about moving forward. And of course we see analogies now with the movement that's occurring in the field of sustainable energy. It is very much about going forward, not backwards.
I mean, we've got so much to talk about, there's so much we could talk about, but let's go back to, in a sense, an earlier period of your life when you were specialising in agriculture. Because how do we know these days what food we're eating, how it's grown? What are the dangers you see in contemporary food production?
Well, one of the big shifts that's occurred in agriculture is linked to globalization. There is a general view that's supported by many of the biggest governments around the world that we need to turn essentially the entire globe into an agricultural production system that specializes in different parts of the world in different things. So as soon as you do that, it means that you need to preserve your foods in such a way that you can shift them from one side of the world to another. If you like, it's the diametric opposite to moving to a system where people in local communities are provided with their food from that community, or at least from that region. And once we have a globalized system, the other thing that happens is that the overall range of foods that people are consuming becomes simplified. We have many fewer of them, and more of us start eating the same things. So that diversity that has existed and that cultural diversity that has existed starts to disappear. So we start to look at particular communities in particular parts of the world that have traditionally eaten foods that grow well in those environments. That knowledge and those agricultural systems are being lost and being replaced, if you like, with a standard American diet, which is becoming the sort of the globalized system of food consumption. As we do that, we start to see some real problems that are developing. One of the common problems is that many people now are suffering gastrointestinal problems. As soon as you start losing gut integrity and the integrity of the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria and other microbes that are absolutely essential for our survival in our gut, we have the beginnings of a problem that can actually take decades to manifest. We're also used to seeing people increasingly being exposed to all sorts of allergens. So in the Western world, there are only 14 legal allergens, and yet wheat and any gluten-containing grain and dairy are two of those. Eggs is a third one, and yet we keep exposing ourselves to these allergens. So if you look at the key phenomenon that links all of the chronic diseases that we have a principal problem with, it's inflammation. So any approach to sustainable health has to be looking at ways in which you can really dampen the fire of inflammation. And there's obviously, it's not just what you're eating and how you're eating, it's when you're eating. And of course, many people are eating 3 main meals a day. They're snacking in between, often with simple refined carbohydrates. And that is really setting the scene for all sorts of problems with, insulin sensitivity, with type 2 diabetes, with obesity, and all of the other diseases that go hand in hand with that, including heart disease and cancer.
Just while we're on that specific, I've recently started myself intermittent fasting. Is that something that you promote, that you reckon does our bodies good? Yeah,
we're big fans of intermittent fasting. Increasingly, I struggle with the terminology because we have to only refer to it as intermittent fasting because we've started to eat so frequently. And many people, if you look at the way in which dietitians are supporting this process, they're busy measuring blood glucose levels, and they've seen very clearly that if people eat little and often, your blood glucose spike is less sharp than if you eat a large amount of simple carbohydrate in a single large amount. But of course that takes away the long-term problem, which is the repeated insults with that blood sugar is actually creating insulin resistance. As far as the dietitians are concerned, they hand that problem over to the medical doctors who say, right, you've now got type 2 diabetes and we'll treat you with metformin or whatever other drug they're using.
Well, we've talked a bit about what's happening in terms of the agriculture, the production of food and the dangers that you perceive there. But the area, I suppose, that none of us really, unless we're involved directly in it, knows anything about is food processing. That term you used, post-harvest. Explain to me your concerns about the dangers in there.
So we have essentially a system of agriculture that is highly intensive now, and not only are the range of crops and even the types of livestock that we currently rely on so much less than those of our foreparents. We also have huge changes that occur post-harvest from the time that we harvest our crops. And at that time, we've got all sorts of systems that are put into play that are linked to food processing and the addition of additives to make that food more stable so that it can have a longer shelf life. Now, if we've been told by our governments we should all be consuming whole grain foods. Whole grain cereals obviously do have a broad range of nutrients, but they also have significant allergens in them, with gluten being an obvious example. What we've seen now is that the more you process those whole grains, the less benefit you get in terms of the blood sugar delay that occurs from consuming complex carbohydrates. And that's because you mechanically process the cereal to such an extent that as far as the body is concerned, it's pretty similar to just putting sugar into the system. So all these children who are now consuming highly processed whole grain cereals might as well just be eating the cornflakes and Rice Krispies they were eating beforehand. And of course, if they were eating the Rice Krispies, they wouldn't even have the gluten. Essentially, big food has repeatedly jumped on these kinds of trends, and then through the process of them trying to do something that increases their profit margins, they actually make the food less healthy.
Forgive me again, another cough.
No
And while we're on that, I know you've been campaigning on water and fluoridation, and how key to everything is water, and what are the dangers inherent in the tap water supply?
Well, water is the single most important nutrient that we consume. We cannot live without it for more than 2 or 3 days. We can live without food for a week or more. One of the issues as we move towards the year 2050, and we're dealing with 9 billion or so people on the planet, producing high quality drinking water for the globe is becoming increasingly challenging. The way in which we deal with this is obviously through our water treatment systems. And of course, amongst these is the use of a wide range of components, of which chlorine is probably still the most important antimicrobial agent. One of the issues we're seeing is that the use of chlorine in our municipal water supplies does have a range of side effects. And we have a system out there. Public health does not want to draw attention to issues with municipal drinking water because there is no real alternative. Yes, those with adequate money can buy bottled water. Those who have access to fresh water supplies or spring or mineral waters can do that as well. Others may be able to put expensive water filters into their house. I myself, for example, do use a reverse osmosis system that takes everything out of the water, including the xenoestrogens that are now an important problem. You cannot really remove all the xenoestrogens out of municipal water supplies, and increasingly we see that any detectable amount can have long-term health consequences, but then you need to add additional minerals back in. So the issue with chlorination is that it's not just the chlorine itself. Chlorine is a gas, so if you pour water into a vessel, leave it for a couple of hours, most of the chlorine will actually dissipate. The issue is that it's also a very highly reactive chemical that then reacts with other things within the water to produce these chlorination byproducts. And those are some of the most significant problems we have in drinking water. So yes, point of use water filters become one of the few solutions that most of us can employ if we're able to actually afford putting in a water treatment system at point of use.
It's kind of been quite negative up to now, looking at all the issues and all the problems, or some of them, confronting us. But in terms of diet and what we can do, I mean, you do promote a particular diet or concoction of fruit and veg and other things that we should eat.
Yeah, you know, all governments do issue advice on what the public should be eating. And essentially this advice that, you know, in the UK it's the Eat Well plate, in the US it's the My plate, but all governments have a version of this. it is essentially a compromise that's been agreed between governments and the food industry. You'll see very often it has significant amounts of processed food within it. It also has a big component in which most of the carbohydrate is coming in from starchy carbohydrates. Our own view is actually starchy carbohydrates, except for younger children and also people who are extremely physically active, where they need very, very large amounts of carbohydrate to deal with the amount that they're burning up, are not really an important source of nutrients. We need to get a lot more fiber. And if we move to vegetables and a diverse range of vegetables as our primary source of carbohydrate, and they have, primarily complex carbohydrates, we reduce the total energy intake substantially. And of course, for many of us, that's an important, particularly people who are prone to putting on weight, consuming fewer calories in the right form is pretty key to the process. But it's also important to not rely on processed foods. So this means a shift much more to home preparation of foods. And in one of the big changes that's occurred post the Second World War is that many people in the Western world are increasingly reliant on takeaway meals, on ready-made meals, on restaurant foods. And these are very often very low-grade foods unless you're shopping and buying very, very carefully. So creating plates of food that are full of colour, consuming all 6 major phytonutrient colour groups, so greens, reds, yellows, blue, black, purples, white, tan, all the colours of the rainbow. A lot of people are consuming food plates that are largely sort of yellow or tan, and they just don't have the diversity within it. In terms of protein sources, if people are continuing to eat meats, we need to ensure that those meats, how those meats are prepared, in fact, how the animals are managed prior to their slaughter or capture is pretty crucial as well. So a lot of the intensive animal production systems actually yield foods that have an incorrect balance of essential fatty acids. The animals are often slaughtered at a time of great stress, so the cortisol levels are high, the hormones can be transferred to humans as well. The animals are often fed with a concoction of veterinary chemicals that can also be harmful. So being very considerate about that. The way in which we prepare any of our proteins is also pretty key, in the sense that we shouldn't be char grilling or burning them or damaging those protein components too much. Moving to slow cooking systems is a great way forward. For many people, moving to 100% raw diet doesn't work necessarily. It can be a little harsh for their gut. It's one of the reasons in Ayurveda and the Indian traditions, there's still an emphasis on cooked foods. As soon as you move to consuming a large amount of pulses and legumes, beans for example, consuming them in cooked form can often be very important, because they may be high in lectins that are anti-nutritional factors in foods. They're actually components that have a sort of pesticidal quality for young plants as they're growing. If we consume them in large amounts, they can actually destabilize our gut mucosa and our gut integrity and create problems there. So that's the reason that a traditional Indian dal is often slow cooked for some 6 to 8 hours before we consume it. So it really is about diversity. It's about having the right balance of macronutrients. Our advice is that if you look at the energy coming into the diet, most of the energy should come in the form of fats, of healthy fats, and not in carbohydrates. So we suggest at least 50 to 60% from healthy fats. Very important to get the omega-6 and omega-3 ratios right. In the standard American diet, we're seeing typically a ratio of some 20 to 1, when in fact our evolutionary background suggests it should be closer to 1 to 1, maybe 2 to 1. And that means obviously getting away from simple refined vegetable oils that now are very widely spread within processed foods. So using more olive oil as a monounsaturated fat, potentially using MCTs and coconut oil that are healthy saturated fats, particularly for cooking. These are changes that people can make relatively easily. But of course, if we don't start teaching young parents and children to eat like this, the patterns are set in and then are very, very difficult to change in adulthood.
You've just reminded me...
I can hear your pen clicking the other.
Sorry. You just reminded me of two things Joe Mercola said when I talked to him. Yeah. One was that if you want to be serious about your health, you've got to realise that either you, your spouse, or somebody you pay is going to have to spend a lot of time in the kitchen. Yeah. And also his new book is Fat for Fuel. Yeah. And he was telling me that so many people these days are not adapted to use fat for fuel. Can you explain to me a little bit about that from your perspective?
Essentially, fat is there to be used as a fuel. One of the reasons that we build up fat beneath our skin, adipose fat, is to have a storage system for energy that we can burn. And of course it's no good just building up your fat reserves and never burning it. So in order to burn fat, we need to use a system that we call beta oxidation, whereby we start breaking down fat. We start mobilizing it, breaking it down, and taking the energy from the breakdown of the fat and putting it into the Krebs cycle, that mitochondria, the little organelles that exist particularly in our muscle cells, but really in all the cells of our body, used to produce energy. And that system, for many people, because they're so reliant on carbohydrates, has gone to sleep. So there is, intermittent fasting is actually one of the mechanisms, a combination of intermittent fasting and calorie restriction, which are both terms that really just are about eating less and less often, because that's how we have evolved to eat, allows the system to start working again. And that generally should be done in association with a much more active lifestyle. So if you add sedentary lifestyles into the equation, it's very difficult to start burning fat if you're going to be sitting, eating TV dinners in front of the television.
Something I often hear people say about conditions or illnesses is that, it's genetic. There's nothing you can do about it. It's genetic. And I mean, I presumed there's a bit of history of cancer in my family, and I've always felt I must be predisposed to this. But recently I've realised that genes aren't everything, and that the gene expression can be changed, and I know that's something that you've written about. So tell me your perspective on genes.
Yes, so, for a very long time we've had a debate about what's more important, our genes or our environment. And of course, if you look at diseases like cancer, there was a time when I think we started to become concerned that some cancers were predominantly genetic, but probably 80% of them were linked to environment. As we move forward, we realize that actually our genes are important, but they're not static in the way that we thought they are. There are obviously exceptions. If you look at BRCA genes for breast cancer, that do significantly increase the risk. But for most of us, it is really the pattern of our genes and the variations to individual genes, what we call polymorphisms or single nucleotide polymorphisms, that are very key. Now we're beginning to understand that there are particular patterns of these polymorphisms that exist together. And the more we understand about those patterns, the more we understand that many of them can be modified by changes in our behavior, particularly linked to the way we eat, what we eat, how we move, how physically active we are. So by understanding these patterns, we can actually start to modify our gene expression, because essentially our health status at any point in time is linked very much to not what genes we have, but actually how we express those genes. So it's a little bit as if The genes are, if you like, the loading of the gun, and when you have a particular environment, they actually pull the trigger. So you have to get that combination spot on.
I was hoping you would use that line.
Yeah.
That line. Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious that all my life, I presumed the doctor knows best. I had total implicit faith and trust in what the doctor told me. But recently I've begun to question that, and I've realised that in all my life, all my visits to the doctor were simply to deal with the symptom. A doctor just doesn't have time to deal with every patient to get at the underlying causes. So what are your concerns about those underlying causes that are rampant today, that current medicine doesn't have the time, apart from anything else, to deal with?
Well, we have a peculiar system in our society. We tend to pull the cream of academia out of our schools and put them into medicine. And then we do not use that resource particularly well, in my opinion. What we do is we essentially turn many medical doctors, particularly those involved in primary healthcare, the general practitioners, into, if you like, glorified drug reps. The bottom line is that the time pressures on them are so acute, they have very little time other than to write someone a prescription. They also have a system of regulation around them that actually forces them into a situation where it's very, very difficult for them to deviate from the standard of care that has been essentially pushed on them. They also have undergone a training system through medical school and then through ongoing professional development that actually encourages them still to be locked into this world where they are treating the symptoms of disease. And essentially, through that process, we have allowed a system to evolve in which the doctor has become God. And in order to see the kind of shift that many of us are interested in, we need to change that balance. We need to re-establish a much more powerful relationship between the doctor and the patient, in which the patient is empowered to be in the driving seat of their own health, and which the doctor essentially acts as guide, not as God.
Yes, because some people are saying that while we have crumbling health services, we have an obesity crisis, there is now, at this time in our lives, more potential for us to live longer, more healthily, more happily, because despite all the negatives, we are learning more and there's more available to us now, but it all starts with taking responsibility yourself.
Yes, I mean, with any system, wherever we are in history, we have more and more knowledge. So there's no doubt that we have more knowledge about managing our health. One of the fascinating things about the last decade or so of research is that rather than seeing the latest research, for example, in pharmacogenomics, pointing in the direction where we would soon all be taking, blue and red coloured tailored drugs, we're actually looking at a shift in which we move to consuming healthier and healthier diets, in which we can actually individualize those diets for the needs of that particular individual. And that would be based on a combination of that individual's own genes as well as the environment and their past history. The difficulty we have is the underlying infrastructure and political systems that control how healthcare is delivered to the public. But to any action, there's always an equal and opposite reaction. And we've seen this very, very rapid development of the pharmaceutical industry that really came out of nowhere in the post-Second World War period, when organic chemistry allowed us to be able to patent molecules that were new to nature. And of course that then became the dominant model for healthcare. And of course we've now realized actually unpatented molecules that have existed for time immemorial are actually much more important to our health. We will not see vitamin C going out of fashion, but we might see the latest antibiotic going out of fashion because we've developed resistance to it. So I think what's beginning to happen now is there is a genuine bottom-up revolution going on. There are more and more medical doctors who are becoming very frustrated with the situation they've been put into, who are retraining in disciplines such as functional medicine that apply a strongly analytical and scientific lens to the system of healthcare and primary healthcare. And they're taking that into their own hands to deliver a much better system of healthcare that is clearly working for people.
So you're encouraged by, I mean, I wonder sometimes, is it just because I'm new to this world that I seem to see this snowball getting bigger and bigger and bigger? Are you encouraged by what's happening in the general world of health, diet, medicine? You're encouraged for the future?
I think that there are some very, very good indications that some of the transitions, for example, the notion of diet and physical activity and even mindfulness and rest being central parts of healthcare, rather than even a decade ago them being seen as something to do with the fringes and not really the remit of what medical doctors should be dealing with. That's now starting to come into the mainstream. How it's being dealt with, of course, is not necessarily right. Many of these areas are quite controversial, and that is sometimes because the science is conflicting depending on who's undertaken the scientific study, what the funding agency or corporations were behind the funding of that. There may be biases within the research itself or within the researchers, and when you have this conflicting body of evidence, it's very difficult for people to gravitate one way or another. I think what we need to do is we need to also change the model of how we measure what is working. And you know, you've probably heard of randomized controlled trials. They basically have spun out of the system that has developed for drug licensing. They're not very good at dealing with what actually happens in the real world. And when we're looking at complex diseases, like, for example, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or cancer or heart disease, these are multifactorial diseases, and because they're multifactorial, they demand multifactorial solutions. So we shouldn't be looking at trials of single interventions. We should look at real-world, observational, reports and case studies that show us what happens when people start combining many of these things. And that's exactly what is happening in terms of functional medicine, clinical experience. If you look at many traditional systems of healthcare, such as Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine, they actually have been doing that for thousands of years and proving that it does work.
Excuse me again. No. This is fantastic, and I appreciate you kind of jumping about over all over the places. Yeah. I'm hitting various things.
That's fine.
I've made notes on. I've still a few more if you're
absolutely
still there for it.
I'm absolutely, yeah.
I would just like your advice on the physical side of things. You were saying we don't need to go and pump iron for hours in the gym. What would be your recommendation for people to kind of incorporate it into their lives? What's the ideal from your perspective?
Do you know, there is no one recipe that is going to work for everyone because we are all individual. However, there are many times it's a question of finding what is the ramp for that individual. For example, for someone who's been sedentary for much of their lives, finding a way of getting them active may be absolutely key. And what tends to happen, what a lot of clinicians have found, is that telling them, you should subscribe to a gym membership may not be the answer. We actually see a huge issue with people who've got gym memberships and never go to the gym. What it may be is actually finding a way in which you can sort out their gut integrity if you find they have a problem with their gut, so that you work on building gut integrity so that they're getting more nutrients into the right places so that their energy systems start to work. It's a very interesting feature of being a human being, or being any animal, when we actually have the right balance in our lives, we actually want to be physically active. And in fact, even for myself, I've eaten a healthy diet for most of my life. From the time that I transitioned out of academia and into running a non-profit and actually working even longer hours than I was working before, I was finding it difficult to do that. And I'd be so tired at the end of the day, I thought, you know, if I jumped on a bicycle and try to ride, 50 or 100 miles, I'd probably get a heart attack. And so for me, it was actually beginning to change the way I used fuel. So I started intermittent fasting. I started to get my beta oxidation system working. My genetics would suggest that I'm very, very prone towards obesity, type 2 diabetes. And by changing the way I eat, and particularly when I eat and how I eat, my energy system started to fire up. I started to be able to burn fat, and lo and behold, I could jump on a bike. And now it's normal for me to jump on a bike and ride 25 miles to work and ride back. And I'm active as much as I can be. I've understood the fact that, you know, sitting is the new smoking. So I won't sit. I'll set an alarm on my watch to make sure that I don't sit for more than an hour without being active. Building bits of physical activity into your daily life is absolutely key. It's not always about putting on your gym clothes, because if you do that, you're putting another obstacle in the way of being physically active. So being able to do a few sit-ups or squats or any kind of activity, moving to the photocopying machine, walking to town to the shops to get your lunch, for example, rather than jumping in the car. Absolutely key. Trying to make sure that you don't eat too late in the day. For me, where I'm a slow metabolizer, another change has been generally not consuming breakfast. We're led to believe that, and it was essentially Kellogg's back in the 50s that convinced us that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. For those of us who have a slower metabolism and need to be physically active to burn fat, that may not be the best advice. What may be better is to not consume breakfast, to have just 2 meals a day, sometimes even only 1 meal a day, and then to take some exercise in your fasted state before you eat again. So it's those kind of changes that can be very important. Getting your fatty acid balance right, which is changing the kind of plant-based oils or even animal-based lipids that you cook with or that you eat, is absolutely crucial as well. Try not to damage your food by overcooking or searing or carbonizing the food. Very, very critical. So different for different people, but really what we generally suggest is try and do several things so that you're looking at diet, you're looking at physical activity, and you're also looking at rest and life purpose. For me, the life purpose has never been an issue. I've always had a purpose in life. But the other 3 components, putting them together into a pattern that works for you, the individual, is absolutely key.
Fantastic. I was just about to ask you about the 4 quadrants, because I hadn't heard it quite put like that before. A couple of other things, if I may. EMFs. It seems to be an area that people are beginning to be concerned about. What would you say are the inherent dangers, or what would you be concerned about in terms of frequencies there?
I think we're beginning to see, as we move to an increasingly wireless world, a very similar scenario that we have seen with environmental chemicals. With environmental chemicals, even to this day, we spend a lot of time testing individual environmental chemicals before they go to market and we're exposed to them. As it turns out, only a tiny fraction of the 100,000 or so industrial chemicals that we're exposed to do we know anything about at all. But it seems the most important issue that we face is to do with overall chemical load. And we don't have good ways of measuring it. What we do know clinically is that where we reduce total environmental chemical burden, and particularly those that maybe have been, where an individual may have been particularly highly exposed, we start to see benefits. When it comes to RF radio frequency exposures, microwave exposures from wireless systems. Obviously, there have been limited studies that had to be done so that mobile technology could go live. We've obviously been working closely with the key scientists, particularly the Swedish scientists that have been at the forefront of this work. The pattern, again, is quite similar, that the people who were doing the predominant work back in the 90s and early 2000s, once they showed that there were problems, particularly from non-thermal effects, the non-heating effects, they lost their funding. They had all the funding withdrawn, and so it's become harder and harder to research this. And what we start to see, again, Sweden has been the first country in the world that's actually recognized electrohypersensitivity as a genuine condition, which is where someone is exposed to too much overall radiation of the RF microwave range. And by putting them in Faraday cages or reducing their exposure, they are able to not suffer the adverse effects. So, and obviously we've seen different parts of the world, Germany for example now, limiting exposure to wireless systems for children in schools, for example, beginning to take effect. It will be a long time before governments around the world act, and we should learn by now that they always do it too late. And we, as members of the public, if we can find ways of reducing our overall exposure, we should do that. So obviously through the Alliance for Natural Health, we have always been advising people on different strategies they can apply in their homes, in their daily lives, that actually reduce rather than increase their exposures.
Well, just tell me what you do or what you advise in relation to what we do in the home, mobile phones, what we do in the office.
Well, actually one of the greatest single exposures can be a decked phone, a cordless phone. So obviously get rid of decked phones at home. If you need to have a home phone, just put a corded phone in. Secondly, would be your mobile phones. Because of the relationship between distance and the non-thermal effects, really do not put a mobile phone against your head. The younger an individual is, the greater the risk. So this issue that has evolved recently in society, that all children believe it's their right to have a mobile phone. Generally speaking, they're given a mobile phone by their parents without having the risks explained. And the thinner the skull is, the greater the risk of thermal and non-thermal effects. So no use of mobile phones on the head by children. Again, there are various systems you can use. You can use the phone on speakerphone. It's quite interesting. If you look at the small print under legal on an iPhone, you'll actually see that it suggests that you don't put the phone within 5 millimeters of the body, and yet everyone has them plastered against their head. So you can use it on speakerphone. You can also get an air pod attachment, so you're actually communicating from a speaker unit through a tube to your ears, so that you minimize exposure in that sense. You should try and, when you're sitting near a phone, to have it some distance away from you, so it's at least more than 1 meter away from you. Another major issue is, of course, wireless routers in the home. The way in which technology has moved along is very few people manage to do without them. The question is, do you need to leave them on all the time? And particularly, do you need to leave them on during the night? So in our household, we use it, we turn it on when we are using it, but we always have it off at night. Again, where you position that router is also key. You don't want to have it close to the kids' bedrooms. You probably don't want to have anyone sleeping in metal beds, because they can act as amplifiers for the radiation. So, I mean, those are the kind of strategies that people can employ quite easily to reduce their overall exposure to microwave and radio frequency exposures.
Fantastic. I mean, that's really good practical stuff. I'm a grandfather now, and hopefully you'll be there in due course with your 6 or 7
6
children?
kids, yeah.
6 kids. It's one of the joys of my life, and one of the reasons why I want to live as healthily for as long as I possibly can, to stay with my grandchildren and see them growing up. But there are particular dangers for kids. I mean, the mobile phone being just one of them. What would your advice be in relation particularly to children in any aspect, diet, exercise, whatever?
Well, I think one of the key things for children is to actually get them to engage with nature from a very, very young age. There are many kids who are growing up in this world consuming processed foods, believing that recreation is about how you can use your thumbs on a device, not being exposed to the natural environment, so that actually in their youth they're not being exposed to the full complement of organisms that would actually start to trigger their immune system. They are often so protected that they barely scratch themselves. The more we understand about kids actually breaking their skin, the more we see it as a trigger that actually enhances the function of the immune system. So the other thing is if you look at antibiotics, there are many kids, because doctors are so used to prescribing antibiotics, and now we see a major issue with antibiotic resistance, one of the biggest issues we've got in terms of our future, in terms of managing infectious diseases. Many kids are routinely put onto antibiotics on many occasions during their early years, and that actually sets up a system where their gut microbiome, the diversity and species mix of the flora within their gut, is imbalanced, and that imbalance gives them lifelong issues. If they are born by elective caesarean section, they're likely to have more problems than kids who are born naturally, because when we're born naturally, we actually are inoculated with the maternal microbiome. So many kind of changes need to be done very, very early on. I'm a great believer that kids should be brought into the kitchen as early as possible. They should be making decisions about foods, they should be preparing foods, they should be selecting foods, they should be, as parents, I think it's, we owe it to our kids. We don't take them out to hunt and gather anymore, but we can certainly teach them how we can consume healthy foods, even if we do rely on a supermarket or a box scheme that we order of organic fruit and veg that's delivered to the house. Yes, and we need to really look at issues like their environmental chemical exposure, their consumption of food additives, their consumption of simple carbohydrates, this notion that we should always reward good behavior with sugar. Well, where did that idea come from? There are many other ways of rewarding good behavior. Getting them to think about the consequences of all the key decisions that affect their health. We've seen this great change in the amount of physical activity that children are engaged in at their schools. We've seen playing fields being sold off so we can build more housing on it. So what are the other ways in which we can help kids to be physically active and engage as communities together in physical activity? So yeah, it's many things. We need aware parents before we can create aware children. Children jump on this stuff very, very readily if they're shown it, but they do need to be shown the way by the parents or the grandparents.
I've heard people say that we can eat a healthy diet, an organic diet, but we still may not be getting adequate nutrition because of soil depletion and everything else. So what would your view be of supplements?
Well, organic is essentially a form of free-from agriculture. It's what you're not putting in rather than what you've already got within that food. So you're not putting in synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides. And of course that allows big ag, if you like, to avoid putting those things in, but not necessarily growing crops with the right cultivars that provide the diversity of nutrients that we really need. So a lot of supermarket purchased organic food isn't necessarily the same as, for example, heritage varieties grown on farm in a farm that would supply, say, to a box scheme or a community-supported agricultural scheme. So can we get all the nutrients from our food? And it's interesting that governments say this all the time. You can get everything you need from your food. Yeah, well, you can. But it's becoming very, very difficult to do that. It's becoming very difficult to do that because the foods themselves have changed so much because of the plant breeding that's been going on. The fact that there isn't this diversity around. If we, for example, consume a vine-ripened organic tomato that's grown in a living soil, we can actually taste the nutrients, and it's got a wonderful, broad flavor that cannot be duplicated by a hydroponically grown tomato that's grown in a greenhouse, that's fed on a nutrient solution that's a little bit like a Centrum vitamin and mineral tablet. It doesn't taste the same. Our taste buds are these phenomenal sensory organs that can pick up this very diverse chemistry in our foods. And we've seen this plant breeding going on so that many of the bitterness factors within our vegetables are being bred out because supposedly we don't like them. And many of those bitterness principles are things that actually fight diseases like cancer. So we can get vast amounts of this and put them in juices and juice them up and drink them. If we do that, many of us will actually be consuming too many calories from fruit sugars. And also we may also consume some phytonutrients that actually destabilize our endocrine system. So, for example, that can happen in terms of people who are consuming too much kale juice, for example. So, I see supplements as an evolutionary trend for us actually filling the gap. A supplement, by definition, is nothing more than a concentrated source of nutrients. Many people think of supplements as the kind of synthetic ingredients, the synthetic vitamins and minerals that are made by pharmaceutical companies that we see in our supermarkets. But actually they're an incredibly diverse group of concentrated nutrients that can be in powdered form, they can be in capsules, they can be in liquids, in any delivery system. These are just delivery systems. And many of us benefit from those kinds of nutrients. Because the food matrix is so important, very often we see when you deliver supplements in a diverse range, there are relatively few people who benefit only from one single isolated nutrient, unless they have a very severe deficit in that one nutrient. Many people benefit by having a broader range of nutrients in supplemental form as well. So one of the changes that's occurring within the supplement sector is actually the inclusion of more and more botanicals that provide the kind of diversity that we lack in our diets. But for many people, we also need fortification from micronutrients like vitamins and minerals, like amino acids, and also an increase in, say, the omega-3 fatty acids that have become quite deficient in our diets.